The topic of our poem for today, Will It Be So Again by Cecil Day-Lewis, is war. The entire poem is clearly an anti-war poem that reflects on the waste of human life and lays the blame at the feet of politicians and leaders who sit safe and secure in their offices and in their homes while others sacrifice themselves for the sake of the country. The poem has a somewhat mournful, even despondent tone for most of it, before it takes a more hopeful, determined attitude towards the end, as the speaker of the poem calls on the reader to resist the powers that cause war to happen and lay the responsibility of ensuring that peace is in the future rather than war. I think it's useful to note that this poem was written in 1944. So obviously the context of this poem, the historical context of this poem, is World War II. I think it's worth bearing in mind that the first half of the century was absolutely disastrous and tremendously traumatic for the Western European powers. They endured both World War I and World War II, and much of the optimism about the human spirit and the trajectory of humankind had evaporated by the time World War II came to an end. So when we hit 1944, and Cecil Day-Lewis writes this poem, well, he had observed 2 world wars, 2 massive conflicts that had engulfed the entirety of their worlds and stripped away so much life. And so this poem is very much a desperate, questioning lament for the waste of human life. And he reflects on how war seems to swing round and round and round, and how humanity never seems to be quite rid of it. Hence the questions. That's why in every stanza the question is posed, will it be so again? Must it be always so? Will it be so again? Will it be as before? Shall it be so again? He's posing the question again and again, which heightens the sense of despondency and despair and the hopelessness that has engulfed their society. And as I mentioned earlier, the speaker places the responsibility at the living and those to come to ensure that this does not happen again, that war does not swing round and engulf the world again. And so this poem provides us with an opportunity to reflect on war and the nature of war, but by extension, the nature of humankind. I'm going to try and keep this analysis of the poem short, and so I cannot have a look at absolutely everything in the poem, but I like to have a look at the structure briefly, because structure and form tends to work hand in hand with the content. So if we have a look at this poem, you will notice that there are 5 stanzas of 5 lines each. Each stanza follows an A-B-A-B-A rhyme scheme, and you'll notice that the second and 4th line of each stanza are longer than the 1st, 3rd, and 5th lines. In fact, the 1st, 3rd, and 5th lines typically are around about 6 syllables per line, whereas the 2nd and 4th lines are 10 syllables or longer typically. So we have a rigid structure to this poem. It's also worth noting that every stanza is a question, and these rhetorical questions are posed to the reader to get them contemplating the nature of war and what brings war about and what it's going to take for us to avoid war in the future. There's a sense of inevitability around there being war. So that is the structure of the poem. Let's read the poem. Will it be so again that the brave, the gifted are lost from view, and empty, scheming men are left in peace, their lunatic age to renew? Will it be so again? Must it be always so that the best are chosen to fall and sleep like seeds, and we too slow in claiming the earth they quicken, and the old usurpers reap what they could not sow? Will it be so again? The jungle code and the hypocrite gesture, a poppy wreath for the slain, and a cutthroat world for the living, that stale imposture played on us once again. Will it be as before? Peace, with no heart or mind to ensue it, guttering down to war like a libertine to his grave. We should not be surprised, we knew it happened before. Shall it be so again? Call not upon the glorious dead to be your witness then. The living alone can nail their promise to the ones who said, "It shall not be so again." If you allow yourself to dwell in the poem and really reflect on it without worrying too much about conducting a close analysis, I think you can quite clearly see that there is a deep set of emotions that rise to the surface from this poem. We can see how deeply the poet is affected by war and the effects that war has on people and his world. Hence the many questions that are thrown out by the speaker. And those questions are quite important. We only really have a set of statements at the end of the poem. Up to that point, there are no answers. And that constant questioning presents a sense of desperation, and it is evocative of a sense of despondency and despair. It's almost as though the speaker feels hopeless in the face of the eternal turnings of the war machine. And it's not till the end that he turns away from questioning and provides some statements as the speaker steels his resolve and calls the reader to stand firm with him, to resist going to war in the future. And I think we can understand this. World War I and World War II were tremendous evils for the world and caused the desolation of Europe and a tremendous amount of suffering and loss of life. One just has to reflect on the number of deaths that occurred over the span of these two conflicts to understand why there was such a profound impact. And that's why it's worth remembering World War I and II to this day. And once I was in a conversation with somebody who expressed the opinion that we should just get over World War I and World War II now. It's been like 100 years, he said. And when I continued speaking to him, it was very clear that he had no real concept of just how serious those conflicts were and what actually happened to people. And this was despite the fact that he had taken history at school and was supposedly educated on the topic. But I think there's a difference between being dimly aware of what happened and actually considering how many people died, how many families were torn apart, how many livelihoods were ruined, how many lives were ruined, what it did to the environment, what it did to cities, how entire generations of young men were wiped out. It was a costly set of conflicts. And that's not to say that other conflicts aren't serious as well. War carries on to this day. But those two were particularly bad. Anyway, let's have a look at the first stanza. If you have a look at that first stanza, immediately you want to pay attention to the choice of words, the diction in that first stanza. He starts off by contrasting the brave who die at war and the people who are the cause of the war. The soldiers who die are referred to as the brave and the gifted. Those are euphemistically lost from view because they have died. By contrast, in line 3, we have empty, scheming men. Consider the connotations of the word empty. There is nothing to these people. They have no substance to them. There is no moral fiber to them. There is nothing to them at all. He's obviously referring there to the leaders who are responsible for these wars breaking out in the first place. And it's these empty, scheming men who are left in peace. That choice of the word peace there is quite deliberate because there's this tremendous loss of life and tremendous suffering that comes from war, and yet it's those who are the cause of the war who are left in peace. Them being left in peace, that's suggestive that they are in a place of spiritual well-being, tranquility, and that's quite at odds with the feelings of the poet, who's quite clearly churned up emotionally and feels what's going on very, very deeply. The other interesting word choice here is to compare that age of war as a lunatic age. Lunatic meaning foolish or mad or crazy. And so he characterizes that time as unhealthy, insane, mad. And the concern of the speaker is that the brave and the gifted, lawyers, doctors, inventors, writers, poets, musicians, they have died and passed away. They've been lost from view. And that leaves just these empty, scheming men who plot to renew their lunatic age. And you can see there the speaker's concern is that this lunatic age is going to come about again. The first stanza is somewhat incongruous. We have the good forgotten, the evil at peace. And this binary is set up here quite clearly for us, and it seems terribly unjust and unfair. In the second stanza, the speaker continues his reflection on war, and he repeats the idea that maybe not the brave and gifted this time, but the best. There's an intensification of the people who have died. The best are chosen to fall and sleep. He again refers to their death euphemistically. And I think that's because there's this tremendous sense of pity that comes out from those who have fallen. He notes that they have fallen like seeds. The simile there is quite interesting. The dead, who are the best of society, are like seeds. They fall into the ground, and from their sacrifice, from their deaths, can grow a fresh new civilization. And I think that the hope is that this fresh new civilization, this new crop of human life, that this new age can produce a harvest of peace from their sacrifice. That's the simile here. But he notes that we, the living, are too slow in claiming the earth they quicken. And so the old usurpers, the leaders, the warmongering elite who cause the problems, who cause the wars, they grab onto this fertile ground. They grab onto this new life, this new growth that springs from the ground, the growth that comes from the sacrifice of the dead. They grab onto it and they use it for their own ends. And so it's inevitable that this new age, this new growth, gets twisted towards war once again. And so we find embedded in the second stanza is the poet not just laying the blame at the feet of the political leaders and the political elite, but at society itself, because we, notice the pronoun we, it's inclusive of everyone. All of us are complicit in the sense that we don't seize the opportunity. We don't reap the harvest of the sacrifice of the best of us. We go about our lives and allow the political elites, we allow the empty scheming men, we allow the old usurpers to reap a harvest of war and pervert the sacrifice of those who have died at war for our sake. And I think this blame is heightened by the fact that it's the old usurpers. This is not a new phenomenon. It's something we've observed before. Hence the question, must it always be so? You can sense the frustration in the speaker's voice. This is always happening because we're too slow and dull to do anything about it. He continues the contemplation of the cycle of war by asking whether the jungle code and the hypocrite gesture will come around again. The hypocrite gesture is the poppy wreath for the slain. It's the war memorials, it's the parades, it's the pageantry and celebration that goes with honoring the glorious dead. But he suggests that it's a hypocrite gesture because the very people who stand and make speeches and who authorize these great shows of respect and honor, who venerate the dead, these are the same leaders who caused the war in the first place. And so he finds that there's a great deal of hypocrisy in their gesture. You might wonder what the jungle code is that he's referring to. The answer is found in line 14. It's the cutthroat world for the living. It's the cutthroat law of the jungle, where those willing to kill and those either strong enough to survive and take the lives of others, or those lucky enough to find themselves coming out on top in a fight, survive. This is not a civilized law. It is savage, uncivilized, wild. In other words, in his questions here, he's asking, are we going to get more empty gestures for the dead that ultimately mean nothing? And is life going to continue being a desperate, brutal existence for the living, with many dying and some surviving, having to lick their wounds as they do so? The suggestion is that yes, that's what faces us. All we're going to get in the future is imposture, pretense. And it's going to be played out on us once again. Again, there's the sense that a great injustice is being done to us. Notice that the final question of stanza 3 suggests that some sort of game or trick is being played on us, and yet at the same time, there's a sense that we ourselves are complicit because we allow that trick to be played on us. You know, there's that old saying, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. That seems to be an idea that's nestled in there. In stanza 4, he continues questioning himself and his readers, and he says, will it be as before, that peace gutters down to war like a libertine to his grave? It's a brilliant simile, that. The image is of a candle burning, guttering. The guttering flame of a candle refers to the end of the candle when the wax and the wick are spent, and it sort of flickers as it burns and then finally burns out. So the idea is that peace is like a candle that gradually burns down and eventually gets to the end of the piece, the end of the candle, and then the flame flickers and gutters out, and we are left with war. And war then is likened to the grave of a libertine. A libertine being somebody who has no regard for moral principles and gives himself into every kind of indulgence, which ultimately results in his death. So the image that we have here is of peace burning unsteadily down to war, in the same way that a man with loose or no morals who lives wildly and freely without any scruples eventually brings about his own demise because of his lifestyle. Effectively here he is asking, is this going to happen again? Are we going to face this again? And this repetition of questions, it builds layer upon layer of despondency as he, in a frustrated manner, says, are we just going to keep experiencing this? His answer here is, we shouldn't be surprised. It's happened before. And if it's happened before, it's probably going to happen again. But in the final stanza, things change. In response to his question, shall it be so again? And again, you see the sense of despondency and hopelessness. But here he turns to his reader, and we get a shift from the interrogative mood of the verb to an imperative. An instruction is given. Call not. There's your imperative. Call not upon the glorious dead. There's no irony here when he describes the dead as glorious. There's a tremendous amount of respect. You just have to go back to the first and second stanzas to consider how he describes those who have died. And notice here, he also stops using euphemisms. He's plain and he's blunt as he calls the reader to action. So in the first and second stanza, it's the best, the brave, and the gifted. He is not being ironic here. The dead truly are glorious because they have sacrificed themselves for us, for society, for the future. And that is something that should be honored, even if you are ardently against war. Particularly in a conflict like World War II, you should honor those who sacrifice themselves for the living, and that is something we'll consider in a moment. So the imperative, call not upon the glorious dead to be your witnesses then. 1, because they can't witness to you because they are no more, but 2, because it's not their responsibility. They've done their part. They can't be the witnesses. They're not alive, and it's not their responsibility. It's your responsibility. It's my responsibility. Don't call on them to be the witness. The living alone can nail their promise to the ones who said it shall not be so again. In other words, it is your responsibility, my responsibility, our collective responsibility to make sure that the world does not descend into chaos like that again. Obviously, we know that since 1944, we have failed to do this. There has been conflict after conflict. Having said that, one last thing to note about the final 2 lines, that idea of nailing their promise. I think this is a nautical illusion. You may have heard of the expression to nail one's colours to the mast. That was basically something that came out of the high seas way back when. And the idea is that if you took your flag, you took your colours and you nailed it to the mast, that was a signal to whoever was attacking you, pirates or just some sort of enemy, that you were defiant and that you refused to surrender. It was a declaration that you would fight to the last man. And I think that's what the speaker is getting at here. I think that's what the poet is getting at here, that the living alone are the people who can ensure that it doesn't happen again. But there needs to be a sort of total commitment to this. This is different from doing something to your profile picture on social media. This is a deep commitment to oppose the tragedy of war in the future by actually making a proper stand against it. And so it's a very strong call and instruction to the readers of the poem at the end to help ensure that it is not so again. And so even though the speaker has spent the entire poem asking these rhetorical questions, suggesting that it is going to happen again, the end changes and there's a grim determination to try and stand against this sort of disaster and conflict in the future. Now, what we've done to this point is to try and understand what the poet is saying. And I think we've got the idea. He's obviously not happy with war. He's quite despondent about it. He recognizes the waste of human life, that we lose the best and brightest, and that somehow the ones who cause the wars never seem to be the ones who suffer. They seem to be able to live in peace and then cause the whole problem again. And there's some fundamental injustice in that. It's worth us considering these ideas, though. Is the poet right in what he's saying here? I think he is, to a certain extent, but he's not. I don't think he's completely right. It seems very admirable to say war is always bad, and it's very difficult to make the case that war is not bad, but the other side of it is that war does seem to be a staple of human history, and that's not it. And as tempting as it is to blame our leaders for it, it really is an indication of a flaw in the collective human spirit or collective human nature. You may not have caused war yourself, but we're all involved in small, minor conflicts, mini wars, whether it be siblings or within your family, with parents to children, and so on and so forth, whether it's in your peer group or friend group. We all cause conflict on small scales, and when you then scale that up and you ramp up to your society, of course there's going to be large-scale conflicts. Does that make it right? No. But it does seem to me to be naive to expect that we're going to be in a position one day where there is no war. There will always be war. There will always be conflict. And the reason I point this out is not to be defeatist about it, but rather it's to note that it's a bit naive to just blame the leaders, especially if you consider, World War II, for example, which is the immediate context of this poem. There are a complex set of factors that led to that war taking place. I mean, there are people now, there are historians now who argue that before too long we're going to be regarding World War I and II as sort of just two parts to one prolonged conflict. You're not going to have World War II without World War I, and the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party really comes as a result of a whole bunch of contextual factors that come out of World War I. And if the ending of World War I was handled differently, perhaps that would have gotten in the way of the rise of Hitler and his compatriots. And then World War II, maybe it happens, but it happens very differently. So there are all of those complicated factors. But it's also worth noting that once you have a figure like Hitler rise, and you have a power like Nazi Germany marching across Europe, you have to ask the question, would it have just been right for the rest of the world to roll over and say, okay, fine, we don't want war, so we're going to not fight you? And I don't think that's a tenable position. So then to go and blame Chamberlain or Churchill or whoever for the war, that seems a bit disingenuous to me. That seems a bit specious to me. I don't think that's a credible position to take. Is war bad? Yes, of course. Does it have tremendous cost? Of course. Would it be better to avoid war? Yes. Is it always our leaders who are to blame? Well, yes and no. I mean, firstly, they make the decisions in war that cause death. If you want to see the sheer waste of human life in the world wars illustrated in a slightly comedic but also serious way, go watch Blackadder Goes Forth. It captures very well how poor leadership causes even more suffering and death during times of war. But also leaders are sometimes obligated to go to war. I do think that we tend to fail to realize the responsibility that leaders have. One of the major functions of government is to keep its citizens safe. Now, I don't think they always do that, and I'm the last person who's going to defend modern governments for the way that they treat their citizens, because, quite frankly, it's largely completely deplorable. But governments are tasked with the responsibility of protecting their land and the people who inhabit the land. And that means that sometimes it is necessary, even if it is undesirable, to go to war. And you have to ask the question, is it really your own leader's fault for war if they are facing a hostile, threatening power? And I think the answer to that question is, well, it can't really be their fault. Perhaps there are other ways of deterring hostile foreign powers. But if all else fails, your leaders are ultimately obliged to enter you into a war. Now, I'm not trying to be an apologist for war here. I'm just trying to deal with real life and reality. It's quite understandable that someone like Cecil Day-Lewis reflects on war and laments it and agonizes over the waste of human life. But at the same time, when we're considering all of this, we can, two things can be true at once. You can both say war is terrible and we should avoid it, and it's often the fault of the rulers and they need to claim responsibility for it. And we also need to try and stand against war and prevent it from happening, and we all have a role to play in it. That's perfectly true. But we shouldn't think that that's the whole story. The other thing that's also true is that war is sometimes inevitable, and sometimes it's even the right thing to do. That's what just war theory is all about. Sometimes you're obligated to go to war to defend a close ally, to defend your own people, to prevent somebody truly evil from rampaging across the globe. But it shouldn't be something that is entered into lightly. And I think that is something that Cecil Day-Lewis is completely correct on. I think as we reflect on this, there's something else to consider here. And this is obviously not found in the poem. You can also feel free to disagree with me here. But there's a very ancient maxim, and it doesn't arise from the ancient Romans, but that's where I first came across the concept. I'm sure it predates it, but there's a very famous quote that suggests that a wise man prepares for war in times of peace. The idea is that if you build up your military strength and you prepare for war in times of peace, war is actually less likely, counterintuitively, because you're a less attractive proposition. The evil strong always prey upon the weak. And secondly, if war does come about, well, you're in a place where you can make it end pretty quickly. What you don't want to be in is a position where you have no military power and you're a soft target. Because ultimately you just become a victim there. And it's all very well saying this should never have happened in the first place. But if there's somebody with a predatory instinct who is happy to take advantage of you and happy to run over you, then you're done. And it doesn't matter what is right or what is wrong. You've been taken advantage of. I think that brings us to the end of our contemplation of, will it be so again? Look, life is complicated. It's very seldom just black and white. There are all sorts of different shades of complexities that need to be taken into account when you consider the world. But the value of a poem like this is that it captures terror, is that it captures the pity of war and allows us to reflect on it and calls us to action. But that doesn't mean that's the whole story. And I think if you're wanting to cultivate the ability to think critically and deeply about not just poetry, but the world, you want to be able to take on board what somebody is saying and say, oh, here's the value to it. But also there's this other aspect that you haven't taken into account. And if you can do that, you put yourself in a position where you can truly engage with the world in an intelligent and wise manner. And that will be the better for you. Until next time, see ya.